What's up, big girl, Northtown Sound? How's it going, everyone? Woo! New camera. Yeah, and I had to buy that thing because Santa brought me nothing this year. Santa didn't bring me that either. That there is Billy. Billy is a 1984 Rickenbacker 62012. Had that thing since 1990 or so. One thing I've always wanted for this was a 12 saddle bridge. At the Edmonton Guitar Show, I finally was able to track down a 12 saddle bridge for it. So in this video, I am going to be swapping over to a 12 saddle bridge. We're going to be restringing this thing, and we're going to be setting it up. Big air quotes on that. And we're going to be doing one other thing. Now, if you've watched any of my other videos, I've explained a couple of times that one of these years I was going to do a video on why you never, ever, 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 ever become a rickhead. That's going to be part of this video. If you don't want to watch that, click there. You can bypass the big rant. I'm probably still going to be ranting as I'm doing the work on this thing because you just know you are because it says that on the peg head. So a little caveat to start. What I'm going to be discussing are the instruments that Rickenbacker was producing prior to their current CNC production. 2002, 2004, somewhere in there, they swapped to their more modern production techniques. There's a little bit of mojo online where they're claiming that happened a lot earlier. News to me. But anyways, we're going to be discussing the older or vintage ones. Back when I was 20 or so, I decided I had to get myself a Rickenbacker. Absolutely had to. Why? Early Townsend. My main man, Pete Buck from REM. Marty Wilson Piper of the Church. A killer guitar player nobody talks about, Dave Gregory from XTC. Another guy who never gets name checked, Jim Babchick of the Smithereens. Check out Smithereens, great band. Even when I heard stuff by, let's say, Brick Smith with The Fall, that kind of blend of the Rick pickups with humbuckers and how they allowed sort of isolated tones between guitars, but they would blend together brilliantly, sort of like what Fugazi ended up doing in the 90s. I just loved the sound of them, and I had to get me one, and I knew the only way that you could get that sound was to buy a Rickenbacker itself. So eventually, I ended up getting Thompson, the heavy metal Rickenbacker. This is a 1986 610 in the apparently quite rare silver-black combo. Still a wicked peg head on this thing. I'm not going to mention the price point because it really doesn't explain a lot. Let's go this way. This guitar, when I bought it, was the equivalent of about 4.5, 5 months worth of rent for me at the time. This was the most expensive thing I had purchased in my life outside of some useless post-secondary education. But it was a Rick. And of course, got this brand spanking new. There was always that production lag with Rickenbackers between when they were built and when they finally got to the retailers. This was from the late and not always lamented late guitar classique here in Edmonton, Canada. About 6 to 8 months later, I managed to grab Billy. This was hanging on the wall in a very short-lived heavy metal guitar shop that was located at my usual bus stop for catching a bus downtown. Literally saw this hanging on the wall on a Sunday behind the sea of Jacksons and stuff I didn't give a crap about. Went in to check it out on Monday, saw what the price was, scraped together the money, bought it on Wednesday. I swear the store closed like a week later or something like that. This would have cost me about a month and a half, 2 months rent. This was a bargain, and I've had this thing ever since. Now, after I picked up Billy, I got 4 other Rickenbackers in succession, one after another. Wish I had photographic evidence. Psychotic ex-girlfriend destroyed my photo albums from that era, so can't show you anything. And Amy, if you're watching this, anyways. So after I got Billy, I managed to find a 85, I believe it was, Burgundy Glow 330. Wicked, wicked color on that guitar, I gotta say. Then it was an 84 330 in black. After that, the Primo Score, it was an 83 360 in black, Pete Buck model. Had to have that when I found it. And then was a 1977 Maple Glow 330. I would own one of those guitars, run into problems with it, flip it at a loss, and grab another one. What was wrong with those guitars? Okay, the Burgundy Glow 330, the neck twisted on it, which is a common thing with Rickenbackers. That was actually the first guitar I learned how to heat press a neck on. And after the second heat press, and it was obvious that it was going to need yet another one 9 months down the line, out it went. The black 330 also had a twisted neck, but it was twisted the other way, and it had this insane rise right where the neck met the body. There was this huge hump that was there. And it was only about a 6, 7 year old guitar. It shouldn't have been doing that at the time. Also, the bridge was in the wrong place. You couldn't intonate it. We'll get into the bridges in a bit. The 360 should have never left the factory. The neck on it was loose. Literally, it was a side-to-side whammy on the thing. Plus, the neck wasn't mounted parallel to the body. It was actually, instead of being straight like that, it was like that. Brilliant. Plus, its neck was going as well. And the rear seam on that was starting to open up. And again, at that point, 7, 8 year old guitar shouldn't be doing that. Now, the 77, which I bought because I figured, hey, if I go a little bit older, maybe I wouldn't be running into these production problems. Grab one when they were making more of them. It was a piece of firewood. Literally, it was. Using Thompson as a model. The fretboard on that one had an open seam that stretched roughly like that. It was literally a gap that you could press close with your hand. I've since learned there was some gluing issues in that era. Its neck was twisted and it had a forward bow to it. I was a little drunk when I bought it. My bad, that's all I can say. It was also coming apart at the seams. The entire lower treble bout on the thing had a gap on it. In places you could physically see into the inside of it, and there was no dried glue there. So I think it had been kind of slapped together at the factory and simply hadn't pulled apart or fallen apart by sheer luck rather than anything else. Now, each of those guitars, when I bought them, would have cost me 3 to 4 months rent. And every time I sold one, it was about 2 to 3 months that I got back because I'm honest. What can I say? I would point out flaws. And yeah, I was a little naive. I hadn't bought a lot of guitars at that point in my life, although I had played tons of them. But still, it was the point that I got really badly hosed and totally turned off the company like many players did. So out of all of those, I only kept two. So I kept Thompson, which is unplayable. The neck is straight on it. It needs to be refretted. We'll get into the frets in a bit here. This also has the super skinny 60s neck that's never got me going. So even though I like the body shape on it and the way the contouring works, you can't do anything with this guitar anymore. I'm largely keeping this to remind myself never to spend huge amounts of money on a guitar. This is a wall hanger right now. And I kept Billy. Simply because A, it's a 12 string. It's actually the only 12 string I've ever owned, even though for the last 25 years I've been trying to hunt down one that plays better. Also because this thing, the neck has never twisted. Simply because pretty well from the time that it was new, I babied this thing so that I wouldn't run into that issue. Now let's go in depth with some issues that you're going to find on these instruments and some things that I can point out specifically with this guitar. When people get a Rickenbacker, what they think in the old era that they were getting is something that's of, let's say, a Gibson build quality, a Fender build quality, a Martin build quality, something like that. These are guitars that were built by woodworkers, not by luthiers. So you're getting something that was built to K quality, Teisco quality, Harmony quality. Except Harmonies, frankly, were built better, so I retract that statement. These are not guitars that were built to a precision standard. They're also guitars that had some very innovative ideas when they were designed. Innovations that were brilliant for, let's say, 1961, 62, maybe not so much in the modern world. So I'm going to go through these guys, point out a bunch of the esoterica on this. We're going to start at the peg head. We're going to start with our friend, Mr. Micrometer, the classic 12-string peg head. So I've loosened off some strings here. If we go in, so at the low E, we can see we're dealing with 9.2. We go at the A string, 8.74. If we go up towards the D string, 9.25. These routes are just all over the place on this thing. You see how rough the routing is in here. So basically they routed it, oversized holes very slightly, and just barely cleaned it up. Now, I have changed the tuners on this thing. The original shallers had horrific backlash. But let's go sort of perpendicular to the nut. What's wrong with that octave string? It's at a weird kink angle. This hole is bored crooked. You see how deeply they bored that? That was from the factory. That was not when I swapped the tuners on this. That A octave has always been a pain to tune up. If I go back a little bit, you can see the wonky angles things are at. The octave high E is tilted that way. The low E's got a slight back tilt. The A's got a major back tilt. And these guys are straight. Pretty common. Let's look at a serious design flaw, which is under this nightmare. Design fail number one. The infamous dual truss rod system. What were they thinking? People have been going on for years and years and years trying to figure out what the heck that silly idea is about. I can explain it to you fairly quickly with the advantage of having a natural finish Rickenbacker. Rickenbackers, for those who are not in the know, the solid bodies are through neck instruments. So the neck goes through the body. However, let's go and take a closer look at that. So here's the body grain, and we're going to go up that neck for a second and take a look. Now, I know it's a little shadowy in here because of lighting, but can anybody tell me what's wrong with this picture? There's a big clue for you right there. Big secret that a lot of people don't know. Rickenbacker didn't use quarter sawn wood in a lot of the instruments that they made in the past. Quarter sawn wood, you say? Well, here's an illustration. You take a log and you're cutting it out via the quadrants around the heartwood. That gives you the straightest grain, that gives you the most strength, and the least tendency to move. What we're dealing with here is closer to flat sawn wood, which is where you're cutting along the grains to get the most bored feet out of a log. That's how you cut 2x4s. This is why Rickenbacker necks have a tendency to twist. Wood will do whatever it wants to do. It doesn't matter what you try to do to it. It will do what it wants to do. So again, if we're looking at this neck here, you see that graining there, and you see that weird little bit of figure that's happening, and that weird little bit of figure that's happening. This is not a quarter sawn neck. And where you can really tell is when you come up to the peg head, you see how the grain is going between the wings and the centerpiece. It's not quarter sawn wood. To try to explain the graining thing a little simpler. So, that's the neck on Billy. You see how the wood is running on it. This is Petunia, which is a first act guitar. So this is a budget guitar. You see how the grain is running on this. So this is quarter sawn, that's flat sawn. Or in a much coarser example, that's a hunk of 2x4. So on edge. See how the grain is cut? That's coming off the quadrants, off of the heartwood. That's flat sawn. You see what's happening? To deal with the flat sawn wood, the idea Rickenbacker had was to put in two truss rods, one for the bass side of the neck, one for the treble side of the neck. That way, when the neck twisted, you could compensate with the truss rod. Now, there's two problems with that idea. The first problem is pretty simple. A truss rod, contrary to what most people think, is not going to work wonders. It will help, but it's not going to fix inherently bad issues. So if the neck twists, the truss rods aren't necessarily going to be able to straighten it again. They may not be strong enough, or they might not be going in the right direction. Couple this with the fact that Rick, up until 82, 81, somewhere in there, actually weren't using truss rods. They were using a piece of flat metal that they threaded the ends on that would hopefully bend. That's why you tend to find a lot of 70s Rick basses with really racked necks. So it's a goofy idea that doesn't work. The other problem which exasperates the issue, and I figured this out the first time that I set up Thompson. So you adjust your relief using your two truss rods, so it's right under the low strings, it's right under the high strings. But then when you go and you touch these, the tension's different on those two rods. And that, I think, is why so many of these necks have twisted over the years, because people will adjust for the relief on the neck, and these two truss rods will be of dissimilar tension on things, and as a result, your neck just ends up warping on you, which, again, is just silly. You also run into a problem when you're dealing with truss rod adjustments on Rickenbackers with that super cool Rickenbacker badge. What's wrong with this picture? You can't mount it with the strings on. So if you need to get the truss rod nuts right access to them, you see the bevy that you got to go through? You got all those strings, you got this truss rod cover that you basically got to take the strings off or out of the way to get off. And then once everything's done, you got to loosen all the strings, put it back on. Just a freaking nightmare of a design flaw that should have been fixed simply by using better wood choices on things. Let's discuss the frets used. Again, 1961 this would have been acceptable, but this is Thompson. This is 1986. So again, we have Mr. Calipers, just zeroing them. Now this guitar has no frets left to it. 0.71 mil height left on these things. And if we look at the width, 2.51. This is all a metric. Tiny, skinny little frets on this thing out of very soft German silver. Now, if I try to zoom in on this, I'm hopefully going to get it. This thing, besides being a fretless wonder, you see the divots. Everything divots the heck out of this. Thompson was strung for years with 11 through 52s, as I was wont to do with a wound G. It has chewed the living crap out of the frets, to the point where I have nothing left to dress on these things. You will also notice that they have the classic Rick no crown to them. They're a very flat crown. That's part of the sound of Ricks, in my opinion. So you're dealing with frets that tend to be chewed up in the worst possible way. Now you see that nut? There's a glue line in that nut. This nut came from the factory. It was in two pieces. They glued it back together and put it back on, probably because it's hard to find black rick nuts. Now, if I go to the side, you've got that honkin' thick fretboard and that skinny little nut. It is impossible to find nut replacements for these things, especially a black one like this. I have been hunting for years, and of course, since Rickenbacker's a little picky on giving out parts or offering parts for sale, it's a nightmare to find. You then have this goofy fretboard, which is lacquered. People think it's rosewood, it's not. It's called pau ferro, which is a wood that you get from Mexico. It's a beautiful wood, I'll say that, and this is a really nice piece on here. Pau ferro has an interesting issue with it as a guitar wood. If you remember back to junior high school wood class, if you take a piece of wood, slice it, and put it under an electron microscope, it looks like a bunch of straws. Sometimes, depending on the species of the wood, sometimes very consistent straws, sometimes you got big and small and big and small. Pau ferro, when you look underneath a scanning microscope, is fairly uniform in size, but it's like bamboo. You have places where it gets skinnier and then wider again, it fills up. Plus, it's got a heavy resin in it. The resin has been used for millennia in Central America as a wood preservative. It's kind of like their version of lacquer. What happens, the resin in the pau ferro will attack the glue that's used, depending on the year, sometimes loosening the fretboards. The other thing that happens with that pau ferro wood is when you go to remove those frets, in some places it's going to be fairly strong, and in other places it's going to be very brittle. So the fretboards tend to crumble, which is why people hate refretting these things, and the lacquer compounds the issue on the fretboard. Everybody I've asked to refret Thompson here, their line is, don't call us, we'll call you, and I don't blame them at all. We're coming down to the nitty-gritty of the job that we're doing here. Something a lot of people don't understand, the Rick Bridge. The Rick Bridge is an interesting, albeit very, very esoteric design, I gotta say. If we look at the 12 saddle version that I'm putting on here, you can kind of see what's going on. So it's a variation of a tune-o-matic style. You basically have a U shape in here with saddles that are pretty substantial and quite a bit of travel. The bridge itself is not the problem. It's actually a fairly well-designed bridge. Pretty incredible when these came out in the early 60s. Really only very few companies were doing anything this good. The only problem is the mounting system that they use on these things. It's a U-shaped channel that's sitting on 4 tiny bolts that go onto a little plate. It's a bit of an esoteric design, so basically what you've got is like an arch shop bridge. It's a floating bridge. But you notice something else about that. You see how coarse those screws are threaded. Therein lies the biggest nightmare of this bridge design. Completely diabolical design. The problem comes down to this. You adjust the height of your bridge on this thing, so the string height's where you want it. But suddenly you're dealing with the stool effect. So if you've ever worked on an old chair or something, if the legs aren't perfectly even, it's going to rock. So you adjust the height to where you want it, and the bridge rocks. So then you have to play around with these to get it so it's solid, and then your height's off. And then you got to adjust and adjust and adjust and adjust. And remember how coarse those screws were. You don't have a lot of room for tilt on things. It's just ludicrous. And then couple that with the insanely gorgeous and yet beyond frustrating Rickenbacker tailpiece. If you've never strung one of these, and we will be very shortly, this can be a complete nightmare. It's a hook-on tailpiece with a bunch of little slots in there that the strings will hopefully stay on. To summarize, esoteric instruments. People think that they're getting something where the workmanship and the design the hardware and stuff are going to be of an idealized quality, which you're not getting. You know, again, people will think, well, it's like buying a Fender. You play enough Fenders, you play enough turkeys on those as well. There's a lot of idiosyncrasies to the design, though, which just make them a pain in the ass to work on. I mentioned I had picked up this new saddle back at the Edmonton Guitar Show, which was at the tail end of September. It's currently just after Christmas. Why have I waited so long? This is one of the biggest problems that I've got with Billy. Again, I'm in Edmonton, Canada. I have to wait until winter comes to play Billy. I have to wait until the furnace has been on for a couple of months and the temperature and the humidity have kind of equalized in my house before Billy is really playable. Otherwise, it frets out all over the place and strange buzzes and stuff. Any other guitar I have during summer, where around here it can get really, really dry, and then it'll dump rain for 2 days. So you can go from almost desert-like dryness, you know, like 15-20% humidity to 100. Any of the other guitars that I own, I can simply go through and adjust them quickly. So let's say, just grabbing Joey here off the wall, let's say Joey, which is an inexpensive Chinese copy of a 70s SG, this thing goes wonky because of change in humidity. It's real simple to set up. 2 minutes on the bench and it's playing brilliantly again. Same thing in winter, dries out. If the neck moves, I can do it real quickly. However, with Rickenbackers, because they take so damn long to work on, you can't do that. So I've always had that compromise. I've been dealing with it for 15 odd years. This thing's only playable in winter. That's the way it goes. It also has never played up the neck worth a crap, which is why I'm going with that 12 saddle bridge. Just keep in mind when you're buying an old Rick, okay, think more that you're getting like an old Dan Electro, or you're getting an old Japanese built guitar or something like that. You're not getting something that's precision. So hopefully I've informed you a little bit here. I'm going to get rid of some of these damn cameras and I got to do some work on this thing.